So what was early Christian art and architecture like? It's actually a little controversial, so perhaps you might have heard this before, but there's always long been these legends that early Christians, due to persecution, worshiped down in catacombs. That actually is not true. How do we know that's not true? It's because there was no light down there, and you couldn't have a worship service with torches because, of course, what would happen, you eventually would suffocated due to all the smoke and lack of oxygen. So in reality, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, Christians would worship in what we call house churches. So wealthy Romans who had converted to Christianity, they would allow their fellow Christians to come over and worship above ground, literally, perhaps, however, figuratively underground. These catacombs, which are incredibly fascinating, they actually were built to hold the huge numbers of people who died in Rome every year. Remember, there were 1 million people in the city, supposedly, and consequently that means that there's a lot of people dying. So catacombs were a way to bury everybody without having to take up large amounts of land, farmland, housing, so forth, outside the city of Rome. These catacombs are still there, and what's so important to realize is that these catacombs were not just simply for Christians, but people of all different religions would be buried there. And that's what leads us to perhaps what we call early Christian painting, which survives primarily in catacombs. And the legend has always been is that this early Christian painting was designed to be secret, where it appeared to be just simply regular Roman motifs like the god Apollo, Dionysus, the god of wine. However, the party line has always been that Apollo represents Christ, and Dionysus, wine, basically communion or the Eucharist. So we don't really have any Christian architecture all the way until the first 300 years of Christianity, until the Emperor Constantine. And if you remember from the earlier lecture, Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and so consequently people could worship above ground, figuratively. So large churches such as Old St. Peter's Basilica or church were built on different parts of the city of Rome. Churches such as St. Paul outside the walls, which unfortunately was destroyed in the 19th century, has been rebuilt to make it look like an early Christian basilica. So you can still get kind of an idea of what these churches would have looked like. They were very big to hold thousands of people because there were a lot of people living in Rome. And they had a nave. The nave was a central portion of the church, which is where the congregation would have stood. Out in front of the congregation would have been the apse, A-P-S-E. That is where the high altar was. Now, in Roman law courts, that is where the Roman emperor's statue used to be because he had to preside over all legal matters, so his statue would be there. Well, now it was the high altar, like at Old St. Peter's and St. Peter or Paul's outside the walls. Coming out from the crossing, which is where the transept attached, the transepts were 2 arms that came out from the side very near the apse, creating the shape of a cross. There also were what we call aisles, which you know what an aisle is. Those went around the outside because oftentimes pretty much all early Christian churches had large numbers of burials and different monuments, so pilgrims could come to Rome, see the Church of Old St. Peter's, which is now where the Pope does all of his most important masses, and they could go around and look at the different monuments without disturbing the church service in the middle. Also out front, the entryway is called the narthex, which is a term. All these terms are still used in modern day churches. And then because the weather's nice in Italy, people would oftentimes gather out in front of the church in what we call the atrium. And they're usually with a bell tower as well. So now I just want you to turn to learn about early Christian art and architecture in the lectures. And there's no discussion question for this portion of the class, but just make sure to then complete the 1-page essay and the 10-point multiple choice quiz.